Hello everyone, this is Fadi, and I'd like to welcome you to our channel, CIRA International. And today we are going to launch, me and Dr. J. Smith, a new series. It's almost like a continuation of something we started almost a year ago. Some of you probably are familiar with a series that we did last year called The Unknown History of Islam. And most of the work that we did at that time was based on the work that was done by a dear brother. His name is Dan Gibson. Today we are going to continue a similar history related to the emergence of Islam and a critical assessment of that. But the highlight here throughout the series will be on the work that is exclusive to Dan Gibson. We want to give glory to God, of course, and give credit to our brother for the hard work that he has done and continues to do. Many of the discoveries that he made or the analyses and assessment that he pointed to in his books have been extremely helpful to both of us and others as well. With me here, as I mentioned, Dr. J. Smith, and I'd like to turn the mic to you, brother, and welcome you and ask you to give an introduction to our dear brother Dan and his background.
Yeah, thank you, Al-Fadi. You notice everything that we do is dependent on other people's research. Now, we do our own research as well, but almost everything that we have been recording comes from other people who have asked us or have given us to disseminate it to get it out into the outside world. So we did Dan Brubaker's material earlier.
Correct.
Now we're going to another Dan. This is Dan Gibson, which we did formally last year. We also did Sarah Lumgar's material on slavery last year. Now, there's a reason for that, and that is because all of these are part of what we know as the historical critique, which is that umbrella area of research that asks question how Islam began, what they did in the 7th century, 8th and 9th century, how the Quran was formed, what we know of the earliest manuscripts, what we know about slavery in Islam. And the material that was the most popular last year of all of ours that we recorded was on this emergent. How did Islam actually emerge?
That's right.
You remember we talked about whether or not Muhammad had anything to do with it.
Correct.
And what was our conclusion?
It appears that no.
No, it doesn't look like Muhammad had anything to do with it.
Abdul Malik probably is the one.
Yes, in fact, it's fascinating. The earliest material that we could see were the Maghazi documents from Ibn Ishaq, and also then incorporated into Ibn Hisham's material in 833, 9th century. The earliest material that he refers to are these raids, these Maghazi, these raids. It looks like this man Muhammad was nothing more than a brigand, a raider, who got booty and brought it back to enrich himself and those who raided with him. And so when you look at that's a historical problem, because if that's all that we know about this man, there's no reference to him in any Arab sources from the 7th century that we can see. We do know that he is referred to by people outside of Arab sources. We know of the Jacob of Odessa refers
That's
to
right.
this Arab prophet. We also know Sabaeus, the chronicler, refers to him in around 660s. These are references that are not Arabs, and they refer to him to warn Christians about him because he's a raider. They don't refer to him as a Muslim. They don't mention that there is a religion, Islam. They don't mention that this guy that they're to be careful of because he's raiding people. That he has received a book called the Quran. They don't mention any place called Mecca at all. And what's fascinating, the people that they're saying to be careful of are much further north.
That's right.
Can you then understand why Dan Gibson, who is a fascinating character, comes into the scene around 1979? Now we're talking about a number of years ago. He had the same questions we had when we were looking at all this. And he started, first of all, to read this book. Now, he went and lived as an archaeologist in an archaeologist family. His grandfather was an archaeologist, Canadian. His father was an archaeologist, Canadian, and so is Dan Gibson, an archaeologist. But they're not archaeologists like we would think, because most archaeologists we know are studied academics who work on university campus and spend all their time on university campuses. He's much more of a Indiana Jones kind of character. Have you ever seen the Indiana Jones series?
Yes.
And for those of you who are watching, maybe you've seen Indiana Jones. Who is Indiana Jones? He's out on the field all the time, isn't he?
That's right.
And he has that whip, and he has that hat, and he has that leather coat. And we love him because the fact that he is doing what archaeologists should do. He should be out in the field. And he was brave. He didn't really care about his own safety. Dan Gibson is very much the same kind of character. Now, the Dan Gibson we see today is quite heavy and balding. He's not quite the Dan Gibson that you see in the earlier pictures when he was actually doing his research. Take a look at some of the pictures, and you'll see he was very much like Harrison Ford. Now, I don't want to say he's as handsome as Harrison Ford. If Dan Gibson's watching this, you'll probably clap me on the back and says, "Here, I'm sending you a check for $20,000. Thank you for making me look so good." No, I'm not saying that. What I'm saying is he did what we want archaeologists to do. He actually goes to every place that he wanted to question. He first started with this book, but before that, his grandfather and his father were both members of biblical missiology. So their interest was more the Bible, and which is the same part of the world. They were interested in Israel, they were interested in Iraq, they were interested in Jordan. And so he grew up in a household that would have biblical archaeology magazines hanging around all over the place. Their whole library were full of these books, archaeological books. And so he would read them. Those were his favorite readings. So he kind of grew up being birthed on the very thing that he became an expert at himself. Then let me just say one more thing. I was fascinated when I was looking at his biography that he loved to read these books that were written by adventurers. Many of them were British, who would people like the fellow Lawrence of Arabia, T.S. Lawrence, right, who would go as an Arabist, and he would go into the Arabia and he'd just live amongst the people. He was inspired by these kind of individuals. And he would read books like Carl Fander, who would go from he was in the Caucasus, and he moved into Damascus. He went down over to Baghdad. He went all the way to India. He learned 7 languages, lived amongst people for 40 years. People like that just inspired him. And he said, I want to do the same thing they're doing.
Right.
In 1979, then, he graduated from college, met his wife there. And then he moved, after getting his college degree, to go to Arabia. He went to the Middle East. And in 1979, he spent 3 years learning Arabic. So he did what everybody should do, and that is learn the language. Don't just read it in English. Go and learn Arabic in the native tongue. And then he and his wife, as Arabists, they decided that they were going to live. Now, I'm just going to look at listen to these countries that they lived in. They lived in Yemen. They lived in Saudi Arabia, your country. They lived in the United Arab Emirates. They lived in Syria, Lebanon, and Egypt. So that's 6 different countries they lived there within the Middle East. And that's what's fascinating. So this is not a floozy that lives his whole life in United States and Canada who's doing his research in books and libraries. He's actually living in situ.
That's right.
From 1979 to 2004. That's 25 years that he lived there. And people don't know this about him. They're not realizing this guy has spent an awful long time living amongst the people. But what he wanted to do, he wanted to live amongst the Bedouin. He wasn't interested in living in the big cities. He wanted to go to the Bedouin. Now, let me ask you, have you ever met Bedouin? Have you ever been?
I did.
Okay, what do you notice about Bedouin? What's your impression of the Bedouin?
I mean, they're nomadic people, of course. They live in tents, they live in rough, environment, but they're wonderful people, very hospitable.
Very hospitable, yeah. Wonderful people. They live in the environment. They're nomadic. They're moving
That's
all
right.
the time.
That's right.
And they're the repositors of the history of that era.
That's right.
Because they tell stories.
Exactly, and they are tribal-oriented.
Very tribal. Mm-hmm. And he found, what he wanted to do mostly, he wanted to go and live and find the old sages, the people with white hair, people like me right now. You're not there quite yet. You'll get your white mantle.
You're jealous,
to get
right?
it in your beard right now.
You're jealous.
No, you're jealous because I'm the one. I'm the one that has all the wisdom because I've lived longer. And he knew that. He knew that the best people to go to are not the young upstarts, not the ones that were coming out of the cities. He wanted to go to the old men who had actually lived there and heard the stories, and he wanted to listen to their stories. Because he was kind of bothered by some of the things he saw here. We're going to get into that.
That's right.
And then he listened to their stories. These were the poets. These were the wise men. And as he listened to their poets, they would relate these stories and these practices and these conversations. But what was interesting, he noticed that they also embellished a lot of these stories. Because he would go to one man, he'd hear the same one story here. Then he'd go, now tell me the story about the camel herd. Tell me the story about the great tempest that happened how many moons ago, or the time of the time of the famine. Tell me about that story. Now, he'd heard from person A over here, and he wanted to hear someone else tell the story.
Right.
They would tell similar stories, but they would also put in their own anecdotes.
And it's kind of interesting you say this, by the way, because the Quran, wasn't it supposed to transmit it through this kind of class of people, basically?
It was transmitted.
Right.
In fact, they're known as the Qusas. The
Right.
Qusas are known as the storytellers.
Right.
They're very similar to the griots that we had in West Africa. I lived in West Africa for 5 years, and my next door neighbor was a griot, very much like the Qusas of the Arabia. And they're the ones that are also the repositories of the history of our area. And I would love to go and hear them, because they would come in with their drums whenever there was a baptism, whenever there was a child that was born. They would have a baptism, they call it. And it was basically a time to bring them into the community. And they would come up to you with their drum, and then they would slap down 5,000 CFA on your knee. And then you were supposed to double it or triple it. And then they would give you a history of your whole story, your own history.
Right.
Now, I'm an American. I never grew up in Senegal. Yet I had a history. And it was fascinating. If I just kept it at 5,000 and didn't double it or triple it, they would tell me a history that was absolutely fraudulent, but it was made up of dacoits and all kinds of thieves and all kinds of prostitutes, all kinds of bad people. And he would shame me in front of everybody. But if I doubled it and I tripled it, I would get royalty in my family. I had no idea that I came from Africa, and I had no idea. And I would love this, because now it's part of the tradition of what griots do. Kusa is very much the same thing. And he noticed that as he was going through and listening to these griots, he thought he went there as a Canadian thinking, oh, these are the best people to get the stories from, until he realized the stories were always being changed, and they were always adding things and subtracting things. The two would not have the same stories. And he realized that there was a problem with oral tradition. That was his first inkling, but he had to get that firsthand to realize that.
Interesting. Absolutely. I mean, he
Oral
lived
tradition.
it there and understood it. Yeah.
And he saw something that a lot of people in the West don't see. We have this romantic view that these people in Arabia, like they are in West Africa, this is what happened with, I don't want to get into the whole thing of roots, the Alex Haley. He was completely duped by those that he heard the roots from, because he thought that he was getting a true history. Until some people from Chicago University went the year after the Roots was written and went to the same griot that he got his story from, and got a completely different story because he gave him different amounts of money.
Right.
Now that's something that Western academics have yet not cottoned on to. Much of the stories from these people, nomadic people, does get embellished. Oral tradition, by definition, is open to embellishment, is open to anecdotes. That's what I wanted to start with, what we're talking about, because that then changed Dan Gibson. He realized that he wasn't going to find the history of Islam just by going to the Bedouin, that he was going to have to do something better than that he was going to have to look at the evidence on the ground, that he was going to have to not listen to what men were saying, although as much as he wanted to. He realized that he needed to go to where these places were. And that's what we can talk about next.
Absolutely. And thank you, brother, for this wonderful introduction. And in the next episode, we are going to pick it up from here, and we begin to dive into more of that fabulous work of our dear brother here, Dan Gibson. Thank you, Jay. And thank you, everybody, for watching. God bless you all. Thanks for watching. Make sure to like and subscribe. Also, hit the bell so that you don't miss future videos. And please consider becoming a patron at patreon.com/CIRA International. And together we can introduce Muslims to the gospel of Jesus Christ. Thank you.